Spare magazines, are they really that necessary? So before I start this video, I want to make a few just notations here. A, I'm not trying to harsh on people who carry spare magazines in their day-to-day carry life. That's awesome. No problem whatsoever. B, this is mostly for the general public and not necessarily for law enforcement. I think law enforcement has a completely different mission than general public. So don't mishear me on this. When it comes to law enforcement or security and armed security in some aspect, carry as many magazines as you can. For general public, I just typically don't find that it's as necessary, but I'll explain the reasons why here shortly. One of the main arguments that we'll hear is that, I may need a secondary magazine to reload in the middle of a gunfight so I can continue engaging the bad guy or bad guys. Now, what we typically find in gunfights is that your gunfight lasts as many rounds as you have in the magazine. Typically, by the time that gun's completely empty, gunfight's over. Now, that's not to say that that isn't entirely possible. Of course, anything is possible. The world's crazy. However, the vast majority of gunfights, and the one that you're typically going to get into, God forbid you do get into one, that magazine is going to be more than enough for that specific gunfight. Now, how many rounds then should I carry in my magazine? For the most part, I believe anything from 10 or more should be more than sufficient for most gunfights. You got to think gunfights are pretty quick, and you're not getting into a Hollywood style burnout with the bad guy where you're both utilizing cover and just completely sending back and forth rounds. Most bad guys will run at the first sign of trouble, so take this into consideration. Another issue that I typically hear is that the magazine is the most unreliable part of the gun. Now, I myself used to believe this when I first started instructing. However, the more experience that I gathered over time working with guns and working with, whether it be my gun or clients' guns, seeing them out on the range and doing video analysis and just kind of reviewing how these gunfights typically break down, the vast majority of gunfights, the vast majority of malfunctions that happen had to deal not with the magazine, but with the person shooting it. Typically what you'll see is that they end up giving too loose of a grip on the gun, or some way or manner they're improperly utilizing that firearm to the point where it malfunctions, because physics is still a thing even in a gunfight. My typical breakdown on the range when I'm teaching students, if their gun is not functioning properly, is that I break it down into 3 steps. Is it the person who's shooting it's fault? Because typically it is. If they allow me to shoot their firearm and that problem is still not insisting, it is a problem with the student. If it is not a problem with the student and it is indeed failing when I am trying to shoot the firearm, the next thing I look at is the ammunition. At this point, this is what clears up the vast majority of issues with the firearm, where they're using some sort of cheap, poorly manufactured ammunition, and done deal. I've only had one instance where the magazine was actually at fault, and that was a pretty rare case of third-party consumerism where the magazines were just absolute trash for the firearm, and it was a very cheaply made firearm to begin with. But one out of about 2,000 to 3,000 students now, I still think is pretty considerable, at least anecdotal evidence, to showcase for me that that is not necessarily going to be a huge issue for me. The third point being reloading in the middle of a gunfight is not very realistic. Another point I want to bring into context here is that you're not really necessarily going to have time to reload your magazine in the middle of a gunfight. Actually, for majority of people, they don't practice that, or even the ones who do practice that, that's still taking up a lot of time where you're being shot at. And there's no guarantee that you're going to have bullet resistant cover anywhere near you when you need to do that. That's not to say that you should not practice your magazine reloads. That builds in good muscle memory and is very good training for you in reaching your goals. However, where we typically see malfunction reloads or magazine reloads is after the gunfight has stopped, and this is more of a after action, just preparation in case the bad guys come back. So I don't see it as being super necessary, and I feel like we could focus our goals in areas that are more important. The third point I want to make here is magazine reloads in the middle of a gunfight. Now, I know we kind of already talked about this, but it's not super realistic. Even for people who train this specific drill or the specific movement, it still eats up a lot of time. Time that, as we previously discussed, where your gunfight lasts as long as the magazine holds its capacity, you're not really running into an error issue where you're needing to do that. Prolonged exposure into gunfights like that, the average person is not typically going to see those. You're not in Mogadishu, firing off 1,000 rounds. You're somewhere in, Midwest at most. Going back to our previous point that your gunfight lasts as long as your magazines do. They're typically quick interactions, and we don't want to enforce the idea and burn all of our training and make it our goal to practice those reloads. That is not to say that training your reloads is a bad idea, nor is it to say that reload training is, building bad muscle memory or anything of that sort. I think it's still good practice, and I think it's still good training. However, the time it typically takes, even for people who do train it quite often, to get that secondary mag in and re-engage into a fight is kind of breathtaking and seems like an eternity if you're in the middle of a gunfight. Where you typically see these magazine reloads being used is an after-action report of making sure everything is good to go. I'm securing the area I just fought for, and it's not an issue necessarily in the middle of a gunfight. Of course, on the flip side, with law enforcement, this is super important, and this is typically where you'll see those reloads because they have to go after the bad guys. So that's where you'll see them having to do multiple mag changes in a few recent instances at least. This brings me to my final point, which is, what is your goal? What is your job as a self-defender? Well, your job and your goals should be to break contact, survive the encounter, and get you or you and your family and friends to safety. So I want us to make that our main takeaway with this as well, is that we should be burning all of our resource and time into training that actually provides to those goals, and not necessarily ignore any other forms of training, but make that our main focus. If that's not our main focus, then we're just in fantasy band camp and we're not actually doing anything productive with our time. Make sure that you're honing in your skills and making sure your goals are aligned with the idea that I am to survive that encounter, I don't go after bad guys, and I keep me and my family and my friends safe when bad things happen. So where do I think we should be putting our focus in on training? Draw the first shot, dry fire practice, and for lack of a better term, honing in our situational awareness. Draw the first shot is something that is not necessarily trained heavily for a vast majority of the concealed carriers of the world. I think it is something that is super important when we think about how gunfights are won. The first person to make the quickest, most accurate shot to the meaty bits typically wins that encounter. Dry fire practice is something that isn't as heavily neglected, but is still something that is neglected for a vast majority of people. Dry fire practice allows you to build in that muscle memory and myelination, which will allow us to react in negative situations more effectively without having to put much thought process behind it. And of course, again, for lack of a better term, our situational awareness. What I mainly mean there is we should be training to better understand how criminals operate, how they do target selection, and what body language, if at all, we can pick up on. How do we perceive those threats and how do we react to those threats? Are they something where we need to be using our gun or pepper spray, or is it something that we can use verbal de-escalation tactics or verbal judo, again, for lack of a better term, to maneuver around those contexts? Thank you guys for watching the video. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like below. Also, feel free to leave comments. We want to hear back from you, whether you agree with me or not. Also, if you're looking on getting in more training, we offer workshops, classes, and training packages that have to deal with a lot of these types of topics, and we would love to see you in any one of our classes, workshops, or training packages. Feel free to visit us at warriormonkclasses.com, where you can find classes, gear, apparel, and holsters. Thank you guys and have a great day.